I have redeemed you. Be not afraid, I have called you by name. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the floods, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be consumed. You are mine, you are precious in my sight. Be not afraid, for I have redeemed you. Be not afraid, I have called you by name. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the floods, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be consumed. You are mine, you are precious in my sight. My love for you is everlasting. My love for you shall have no end. When you pass through the waters, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the floods, they will not sweep over you. You will not be consumed. You are mine, you are precious in my sight. You are precious in my sight. You are precious in my
Are you wondering what the title of today's sermon means? It is a Jewish word pronounced Shema, as if the E is almost silent, and means listen, or hear and do, or remember, or all three of these. Most importantly, it is the first word of the traditional prayer used in Jewish morning and evening services, and along with the second word, Yisrael, serves as the centerpiece of these prayers. Confused? Found in Deuteronomy 6:4, which I read as part of this morning's scripture lesson, it continues, as you already heard, hear, listen, remember, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Observant Jews consider the Shema to be the most important part of any prayer service, and its twice daily recitation as a mitzvah, a religious commandment. Indeed, it is hoped that a Jew will be able to say the Shema as his or her last words, and parents teach their children to pray it before they go to bed at night, somewhat like our "now I lay me down to sleep," but even more meaningful. Morning and evening prayers every day. A bedtime prayer every day. Constant recitation and repetition makes an impact and has an effect. In my early teen years, I can remember as a Lutheran going to catechism classes and having to learn by heart scriptural and creedal passages and what they meant. We might not have always understood what they meant, but we learned a great deal of material word for word. When I was a member of DMLA, because I had a good memory, I served as the chief installing officer, the one who inducted newly elected leaders into their positions by reciting pages of explanations and instructions from the manual. Over the years, I have performed in numerous plays and, of course, had to memorize lines. In my first dramatic role, in 3rd or 4th grade, I was the voice of the American flag at an Independence Day celebration at school. I would have preferred being George Washington, but I had a better memory and considerably more lines, so Ernest Lund got that part, and I stood behind a screen from which the flag hung. I said I had a good memory, but maybe my brain had not yet adequately developed, because in retrospect I realized that I could have held the script in my hand and read it, since nobody could see me anyhow. Oh well, good practice for later Academy Award quality performances. And I saw some of you nodding as I related my experiences, so obviously you have also been there, done that. Hear, listen, remember. If you have ever put a child to bed, this action preceded by the reading of a bedtime story, you know what usually happens in such situations. You finish the tale and think that you are done, only to be begged with again. This can go on for quite some time, even though the child probably knows the story by heart and can recite it every bit as well as you can read it. And the reason he or she can recite it is because he or she has heard it again and again and again. The kid might be stalling for time because he or she really doesn't want to go to sleep, but there's also a genuine interest in hearing repeatedly something which has meaning for him or her. Hear, listen, remember. We can learn and remember by saying and doing the same things over and over and over. My mother loved poetry, and she could recite some of her favorites years after she had last read them. And Lorraine's grandmother knew a complicated and convoluted description of a flood using incredibly big and unfamiliar words which she could quote at the drop of a hat, even in her early 90s. Tomorrow is Memorial Day, and in a slightly different sense, it is all about remembering. It is all about remembering especially those who have given their lives in service to their country, but also those near and dear to us who are no longer with us. There are many traditional ways in which we celebrate Memorial Day. Perhaps we have parades and or picnics with bands and speeches if they are public events, or with family and friends if they are private affairs. Perhaps we just barbecue in the backyard as part of our resting and relaxing. Perhaps we go to the cemetery to put flowers on the graves of our deceased loved ones. Perhaps we just take a few moments to think about our deceased loved ones and what effect they had on our lives. And perhaps we hang the American flag as a demonstration of our participation. If it is on a flagpole, in the morning it should be raised briskly to the top of the staff and then solemnly lowered to the half-staff position. There it should remain until noon, at which time it should again be raised to the top, where it should stay for the rest of the day. Why? The half-staff position helps us remember the more than 1 million men and women who have given their lives for their country. And at noon, that memory is raised by the living, who, thus resolving that their sacrifice must not be in vain, rise up in their stead to continue the fight for liberty and justice, the proclaimed foundation on which our country was founded. Memorial Day, while it has no direct ties to any religion, has nonetheless turned into a kind of sacred event. And many scholars agree with sociologist Robert Bela that the United States has a secular civil religion despite its insistence on the separation of church and state. It is based on our assumption that both collectively and individually, we as Americans are obligated to carry out God's will on earth, a theme which lies deep as an American tradition. This, of course, leads to problems when we insist that we know God's will and that, therefore, whatever we do nationally must be right and righteous. Then, with the advent of the Civil War, a new theme of death, sacrifice, and rebirth became part of the American fabric. And Memorial Day gave ritual expression to these themes, integrating the local community into an increased sense of nationalism. The American civil religion was never, in contrast to France, anti-clerical or militantly secular, nor was it, in contrast to Britain, tied to a specific denomination, in this case the Church of England. Rather, we Americans borrowed from different religious traditions so that the average American saw no conflict between religion and nationalism, and deep levels of personal motivation were aligned with attaining national goals. The dilemma, then, is that too often we cannot distinguish between our faith and our country, and the two become intertwined and interconnected to the point that sometimes both are diminished and harmed. I would submit to you that it is not healthy for our nation to have its citizens believe and insist that whatever we do is in keeping with God's will and way, and that we are on the same wavelength as the divine, because then there will be few, if any, checks on what we do as a country, a situation which could lead to all kinds of abuses and sometimes has. I would submit to you that it is not healthy for our religion, our religion, to have its adherents put our nation on a pedestal which all too often stands a bit higher than God, and act as if that nation has somehow become God, because then it gives up two of its major purposes, which are to serve as a moral and ethical compass in determining the direction to which our nation is moving, and a moral and ethical barometer showing its people that what they must do nationally to implement what they claim to believe in response to the teachings of their faith. The United States is not a theocracy. In other words, we are not governed by religious laws, as are, for example, Israel to a limited extent, and Saudi Arabia to a great extent. And please remember here that even in such cases, the religious laws of the land are implemented by men and women who are implementing them based on their interpretation and their understanding of the teachings of their faith, which are subjective rather than objective. So it is that a rogue state like ISIS can claim that it is doing God's will and following the teachings of the Quran, no matter how brutal and inhuman they act, and no matter how many other Muslims disagree with them. I am sure that you have often heard the expression, "my country, right or wrong." And that is quoted as originating from Karl Schurz, a German immigrant who served as a Union general in the Civil War, and who in turn borrowed it from Stephen Decatur, an American naval officer who gained renown fighting the pirates of Tripoli and in the War of 1812. The problem is that this is not the entire quotation. What Schurz really said was, "my country, right or wrong, if right to be kept right, if wrong to be set right." Big difference there. And this is where religion and nationalism should intersect. Our nation should always want to do what is right and good, and our faith should serve as a watchdog, making sure that from a religious perspective, our nation is doing what is right and good. Additionally, we as people of faith must make sure that the only entity we worship is God, and that while we love and respect the United States, we do not worship it. Can we, should we, echo the Jewish prayer and cry, "Shema USA"? Should we likewise promise to hear, to listen, to remember? I suggest that we should. On Memorial Day and on every day before and after Memorial Day, we ought to strain to hear the voice of God speaking to us of goodness and righteousness, of love and peace, of justice and compassion, as we seek to make ourselves the very best people that we can become. And we ought to listen to our hearts as we strive to implement our best impulses in our individual lives and in our national actions, so that our nation will indeed always attempt to do what is right. And we ought to remember the wisdom, the strength, the courage, the goodness, the faith of those who have gone before and have also tried to uphold all that is good, often through selfless sacrifice. Remembering is very important in Judaism. In the Jewish faith, unlike in Christianity, there is not a heavy emphasis on an afterlife. Rather, there is the belief that those who die are principally remembered by those who are still alive. And through those memories, they also continue to live. So the good that Jews do during their lives is not so much motivated by the promise or expectation of later rewards in heaven, but by the hope that their goodness will be remembered and will positively influence the attitudes and actions of those doing the remembering. It seems to me that that is a good lesson to be learned by us as we celebrate Memorial Day. Interestingly, today is also Pentecost. This commemorates the coming of the Holy Spirit to the disciples as they hid out in Jerusalem after the death and resurrection of Jesus. We are told in Acts that they were huddled behind closed doors and barred windows, having been instructed to do so by the risen Christ, and additionally, still afraid that the fate of Jesus might become theirs as well. Suddenly they were engulfed by a violent wind, and they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire resting on each of them. With that, they were filled with a God presence and inspired to continue the work of Christ, regardless of the dangers or the difficulties. So they too had, in a sense, experienced Shema. They had heard, they had listened, they had remembered, and they were ready to go. Our nation, like all institutions of whatever size, is a work in progress. It is not done. And we, like the disciples, are works in progress. We are not done. I suspect that it and we will never be done. But what I know is that the direction it and we take toward that completion will be determined by what we believe and what we do in the here and now, and what others believe and do in their here and now, past and present and future. Hear, listen, remember, Shema. Like the wish for our country, may we be always in the right, and may we correct our wrongs to make them right. Hear, listen, remember, Shema. Let us on this holiday look to who and what were great and good in the past for inspiration and insight, and apply that toward the attainment of greatness and goodness in the time to come.